Caitlin Clark. A name that probably a few years ago many of us did not know, but now a nationally recognized basketball player with her swishing shots outside that three-point line. You all know who I'm talking about? Yes, of course you do. Women's basketball player for the Iowa Hawkeyes. She is amazing to watch, isn't she? And the whole team, in fact, any team, when I can see those three-point shots going in, it blows my mind. The sight, the vision, the abilities, and the skills to make something like that happen. It's fun to watch, isn't it? And so we do watch. We think about the joy of those team members being together in times like this. I was thinking about the contrast in the story of someone like Caitlin Clark to this blind man, an unnamed blind man that we don't even know a first name. How different. I began to think about what it might have been like or must be like to be born blind. Thank you, Kristen, for bringing that to life in a new way for our children. But without the ability to see, which is something that most of us all take for granted, and I am sensitive to those among us who are vision impaired or have other disabilities and things that hinder an attempt at a successful three-point shot or many other things. This unnamed man, he was really an outcast on the streets of that day. There weren't social services around and other support that he may have found today in his blindness. There weren't crowds cheering him on or any team that was working together to achieve something good together. One thing is for sure, the story isn't about any sin of the man or the parents. He had not even asked to be healed. He simply was there. It's a story of many things, of God's healing grace, of spiritual sight and physical sight. And there's many messages in this passage that we shared together to us and to the church. It's a message also that we receive through a man with this disability and vision. A story like this that stirs some of those questions, like why are people born so differently? Where some can see and one cannot, where some are basketball stars and some are not, why some are healed on this earth and some are not. I do not have the answers to all of those questions. But one thing remains, and that is that for all of us born, gifted with life, we are in this together. And so as we're reflecting during the season of Lent in many different ways, individually and as a church, here's a couple reflections this morning. First, how curious in that story that we shared with this miracle of healing that happened, that's the people that walked by this man every single day didn't recognize him. I mean, the only thing that really changed were his eyes, right? Had people really only noticed the disability, his blindness, that they didn't even recognize all the rest about this man? Was his blindness the only thing that they ever saw? Prompts me to ask the question of how we look at people and how we truly see a person or not. Do we focus on a disability that someone has more than who they are as a person? Whether it's vision or hearing, social, mobility, intellectual, all sorts of distinct abilities or not. What we notice, what we're blind to in seeing an entire person, it's a powerful question, really, about first impressions, maybe about prejudice, maybe about blindness to what we don't know or we don't recognize or what we don't even seek to discover about another person. That's one reflection. There's a second reflection. This is about the religious leaders and their community in this story. Now, a little history would tell us that these disabilities were thought to have been related to sin. You got that through our gospel reading together. Society wanted to blame someone, and for the religious leaders there, they thought that it must have been the man or their parents at first. And then after this healing, well, then they wanted to push the blame onto Jesus. Jesus must be the sinner, not the hero in this story, because he did healing on the Sabbath. You weren't permitted to do that unless someone's life was in danger. In fact, you weren't even supposed to walk very far because that was considered work on the Sabbath, and Jesus had him walking to the pool. The leaders didn't like this miracle. They wanted to control things. They wanted to control the narrative. They didn't want to hear or believe this man's story because it was so different than their own. They wanted to put Israel back on top of the throne with power, and they wanted to do this by the way that they were with people and the way that they would order the people around. They wanted themselves left in control of all the goods, of all the services. And so it was the religious leaders that had shut this person out and ended up expelling him from the temple and from the community. Think about how rules can separate us from people who are in need or for people who are suffering, leaving people ostracized. And if the Pharisees were able to see spiritually, if we look at sight, not only physical, but spiritually, their first step would have been to see whose presence they actually were in. They were in God's presence, and they could not see that. They actually were the disabled ones. They remained blind to this whole episode with their focus on the letter of the Sabbath law and their desire for their power and control, rather than seeing the light that was right with them. To see could have meant to celebrate someone's before and after story, to celebrate someone's encounter with Christ. To see could have meant to be able to recognize that the law of love is divine right there through relationship and continued inclusion in a community. It's interesting that beyond the alienation of the community and the religious leaders, this once blind man, his own family backs away from him. Did you catch that? His own family put their own safety before their son's welfare. They didn't even celebrate his healing because of the fear they had of the leaders that were casting anyone out. And this fear overwhelmed any chance of inner joy from the parents to their son's healing. This is a cheerful story, isn't it? In this story, the only folks that are found trustworthy, apparently, would be the blind man and Jesus. The blind man has his own faith journey happening here, right? So did you notice his physical sight is restored as well as his spiritual sight? So his healing is that before and after story. And there's a miracle that really no one can explain. But they can only see the difference of what his life was before and what it is after. People can't argue with those kind of results. Can't explain it, but he can testify to his life before this encounter of the holy saliva mixed with the unclean dirt and going to that pool whose name meant sent. Jesus sent him. Jesus sent him. Jesus sent to us. All sorts of ways we can think about that word, of that description of the pool where washed indeed a healing happened. Jesus with the blind man. And like the Samaritan woman that we spent some time with last week, the blind man gradually begins to see whose presence he's in. He's on this faith journey and he keeps reflecting on it. And he slowly discovers whose presence he is in to the place where indeed he worships. Through this experience, Jesus steps away after he's healed the man, and then he later returns into this dialogue after he's found the man expelled from the community. Jesus shows up then. And like that Samaritan woman last week, Jesus again is connecting with those who find themselves on the margins or in a place of suffering, like a cast out sheep. And now this man enters the fold again, finds the protection there again, finds a relationship there again with the shepherd. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want, the blind man comes to believe. It's in the healing, it's in the showing up again, and it's in the truth-telling to the religious leaders that Jesus shows up then and for all of us now. The light of the world is here with us. It seems to say, don't close our eyes right now. The light is here. That we too can be spiritually blind when we don't see the truth of this law of love over the letter of the law. That we too have an invitation from Jesus to open our eyes wide to God and the wholeness of others. That we wouldn't be blinded by it, that we will be saved by the light of Christ, and that Jesus' love is other-centered. God's love is for you, and that is the good news in this story. So I think about our families, I think about our church, and we have said that we want to welcome all. Look at your worship materials. We have a welcome statement printed right there where we name all who are welcome here, and it includes us seeing deeply each person. That takes effort. People who are differently abled. People with differences. How is our vision still limited to what we see in someone else? We can easily try to find reasons for maybe why someone is the way they are, but can we look at the whole person? Churches can support this. We can be that healthy community. We get to know those who have different abilities. And sometimes people with different abilities tend to shy away from others. Friends, keep your eye out. Look around. Offer transportation like I know some of you do for people that need that sort of support. Help with errands. I know some of you do. We continually look at our church building here for accessibility. And we know that there are some challenges in this sanctuary for mobility. Into the back of our sanctuary, our front doors are open, and we have people here to help. But we are mindful that it is not always ideal to not be able to come in from the back. Disabilities might not be obvious as well for some of us. Sometimes we can see someone walking with a cane or in a wheelchair, but sometimes we don't see what is there. Every single person wants to feel loved and included. Every single person. I share from our church's, our denomination's social principles, and I'd like to just read the statement. We recognize and affirm the full humanity and personhood of all individuals with mental, physical, developmental, neurological, and psychological conditions or disabilities as full members of the family of God. We also affirm their rightful place in both the church and the society. We affirm the responsibility of the church and society to be in ministry with children, youth, and adults with mental and physical and developmental, psychological, and neurological conditions or disabilities whose particular needs in the areas of mobility, communication, intellectual comprehension, or personal relationships might make more challenging their participation or that of their families in the life of the church and the community. We urge the church and society to recognize and receive the gifts of persons with disabilities to enable them to be full participants in the community of faith. And we call the church and society to be sensitive to and advocate for programs of rehabilitation, services, employment, education, appropriate housing, and transportation. We call on the church and society to protect the civil rights of persons with all types and kinds of disabilities. It's written in our St. Paul's history that Helen Keller spoke once in this sanctuary. I'd love to know what she had to say to those of us with sight. As often is the case, as we grow older, our abilities and our disabilities change. Would you agree? I can name some things physically, and I can also name some things spiritually that I was blind to at an earlier age, but now have seemed to become more clearer to me. I was blessed last year to be invited by Judy Fitzgibbons to volunteer at a health fair for the Special Olympics. There was such joy in the community there, in the fellowship there that not only welcomes but embraces each one to play their sport with no one thrown out from the community or the sport. My parents will be watching Caitlin Clark this afternoon. Like many of us will be. I hope it's a great game. My mother is limited in her mobility and in her vision. My dad offers faithful care every day. And when I go to visit, he encourages me to sit and talk with Mom. Don't worry about the task around the house that might need tending. Because that's what matters. It's that relationship. The relationship of love. It's the relationship that is the treasure. It is the relationship that is the win for all of us. Care and compassion. Love is what we can offer to each other in each city and in each place, and the church has a role to play in that as our families and friends are spread across geographical areas. May we be that for one another in St. Paul's. Indeed, Christ has come to love and to set us free. May it be so, this able-bodied part, the body of Christ right here. Amen.